I want to start with something that really started percolating for me in my mind after your really rich conversation with our colleagues yesterday. One of the things you said was had to do with how the victims become perpetrators, and how the identity of victimhood takes over the definition of self, to the extent that you can do anything. You can do anything. There are no limits to what you can do because you are a victim. And in the context of what we have witnessed, and which is the subject that has brought us to this conversation for us, can you tell us more about that?
Sure, but let me begin by saying what an extraordinary honor it is for me to be here. So thank you all for coming. Thank you above all to Pumla Gobodo-Madikizela for inviting me to join in this conversation. I've been an admirer of your work. I've been the reader and rereader of your work, going back to A Human Being Died That Night, which is more than 20 years ago now, I believe. And I've been tracking what you've been doing, and tracking above all a mood of hope and defiance which runs through all your work, however deep you have to go, however dark you have to enter the space, however dark space you have to enter. And you work with affect, and you work with truth, and you work with repair, and you work with reconciliation and remorse. And every time you bring these things to the surface, it's as if you're just saying, look into this mirror and see yourself, and you will understand how difficult these processes are. So I think there is a real link between psychoanalysis and the work of truth and reconciliation post-1994 in South Africa. I was very glad that you mentioned the question, Golda Meir's statement, because I think it really is syntactically one of the gems, i.e. the ugliest statements that have been made on these issues for a very long time. She made it several decades ago, and she simply said, just to re-present you with it, Paula's already mentioned it, but just to re-present you with it, she said that we will forgive the Arabs when the peace comes. That's already optimistic. When peace comes, we will forgive the Arabs for killing our sons, but we will not forgive them for making us kill theirs. As if the worst atrocity was the violence of which Israel in that moment ceases to be the originator. That's to say, Israel is never the origin of their own violence. It is always a response to a violence that has preceded it. And I think this is absolutely ingrained in Israel's description of itself, and it has caused the horror and despair of unlikely people. I shouldn't think many people in this room have heard of Shulamit HaRaven. Shulamit HaRaven is one of the most distinguished Israeli writers, who was a member of the war in 1948. She was part of the army. She was doing radio work, so she wasn't actually killing people. Also an incredible novelist. And in 1980, she wrote an article called Identity Victim. And she said, basically, Israel has entrenched itself so deeply in the idea that it is the victim of the horror of the world, not completely untrue by any means, and therefore is incapable of ever being the originator of its own violence. So this leads to something that is going on today, where recognition of the Shoah disqualifies any critique and justifies anything Israel does on behalf of the security of the state. And the idea of the security of the state has been a kind of flag that Israel has waved about itself for a very long time. And there's a wonderful human rights activist called Mary Weingarten, who worked for Physicians for Human Rights in Israel for many years, and then came to England. And she said at a talk to put people together to discuss this, what seems to be unbreakable crunch between Israel and Palestine. This was several years ago, and she just said, in Israel, every time anybody says the word security, everybody stands up straight, puts their arms by their sides, and stops thinking. So she was positing a real relationship between the refusal to think and the self-victimization and the need for military security for the state. By the way, when Israel says we have the right to self-defense, and occupying power does not in international law have the result of unlimited self-defense. So there is a big issue we had there, it takes us straight into the heart of politics. I was on the question of victimization, I have a formula which I always wheel out here, so forgive me if you've heard it before, which is victimhood is something that happens to you. It is an assault, it is an outrage, it is a violation of human rights. The moment it becomes an identity, psychic or political, you're finished. You're trapped. Okay, so I would like to hold on to that as a kind of mantra for what I do. I'll give you my other mantra whilst we're on mantras, if you'll just give me a second. This is my feminist mantra that goes into the cover of a new edition of a book called Women in Dark Times, which is this: we are feminists. We fight injustice against women. We are not innocent. We are not in flight from the darkest secrets of the soul. For that reason, we do not have to project them onto the world, enact them in the world in order to live them. We are feminists. Listen carefully to what we have to say. So that idea that what feminism is about is not denying the inner violence of which we're all capable of, certainly pointing to violence against women, but not in the name of an identity of victimhood. It always leads to more violence. Shulamit Harevan says in 1986 in her essay, Identity Victim, she says, if you see yourself permanently as the victim, it licenses any atrocity. She is a loyal member of the Israeli nation. She is appalled. She thinks it goes against the whole tradition of justice and human rights, which is inscribed into religious law and Jewish religious history. So that's just one example of where different forms of affect and different forms of connection clash and open up and reveal something about them, which it's then very, very hard to deal with. So I would love to know more about how you see that. I'll pause for a second, but I just want to say this one thing which I think is important as part of our beginning. When Pumla and I had our conversation about today, you rightly said, and you said it again now, that the concept of witnessing which you work with starts with the Shoah. It starts with the Holocaust. That was the first time when the actual visibilization of what had gone on and the traces of which had been burnt to cinder, the actual understanding that this is what happened, took on an ethical value in and of itself because it was so impossible to countenance. So it begins, therefore, with the Holocaust. One of the most difficult things is to draw the link between the Holocaust and what is happening in Gaza today. And the gentleman sitting next to the lady in the yellow dress, forgive me for not knowing your name, Stephen Robinson, yes, Stephen Robinson, asked yesterday, is Gaza the new Auschwitz? It's very loaded, your question, but that there is some connection between the two things was at the center of the work of Edward Said. And this is, for me, one of his most fascinating formulae. There is a link between what happened to the Jews in World War II and the catastrophe of the Palestinian people. But it cannot be made only rhetorically, or as an argument to demolish or diminish the true content both of the Holocaust and of 1948. Now here is the impossible sentence. Brilliant sentence, because it's impossible, right? Neither is equal to the other. Similarly, neither one nor the other excuses present violence. And finally, neither one nor the other must be minimized. There is suffering and injustice enough for everyone. We must think our histories together. Okay, now that's something you said yesterday about thinking the histories together and what that can do, how far it can go. But there is suffering and injustice enough for everyone. When I presented that quote at an event to relaunch Edward Said's amazing book, The Question of Palestine, there is suffering and injustice enough for everyone. I just said, is there? I say, are we in a position now where that sentence holds? And if not, why not? And what can be done about it? So that's my first response to your question, Pumla. So I don't know whether you want to go.
I do just want, yeah, because I want you to say more. Obviously, we've been thinking about today's talk, but just to follow up on the points you're making. So this idea of victimhood identity, and if we put that next to the idea of the never again, and yet we are increasingly experiencing the over and over again, isn't that also, in a way, a kind of a repetition in psychoanalytic terms, but also raises the question of when will it end? You know, I mean, if you think about also other contexts, even our context, how things sort of change, but they remain the same, and some things repeat over and over again. And certainly, what we're witnessing in Gaza, there's always a sense of, you know, when is peace coming? You know, when is justice going to happen? When, and so there is this idea that the notion of the possibility of something will happen, but at the same time, there's almost like this sense of hopelessness, like it's repeating, it's happening over and over again. I mean, the struggles that started way back, you know, whether they're happening in Gaza or in Lebanon, you know, outside these contexts, the sense that this is repeating, is happening over and over again. Is there an answer via psychoanalysis, or is there an answer via poetry? What is going on? How do we actually even find language to speak about what's going on?
Whoa, how long have we got? Is there an answer? I'm not going to answer that question, right? Is there an answer? But after I noted down that quote from Abu Said, I just said to approach this question involves going back in time. We have to all be historians, taking the measure of historic demonic repetition. Right? Historic demonic repetition. So for me, some of these repetitions and some of these uncanny returns to a situation that we like to think we had transcended, right? They take on the form of a compulsion. Hannah Arendt was brilliant on this when she was analyzing totalitarianism. She talked about the compulsion with which we compel ourselves. So the question at this point will be whether you want or not to go down the path which is about the demonic component of all human subjectivity and how we do or do not mediate it, or how we do or do not enact it. Which is why in that mantra I imply that men are so busy trying to control themselves in the world, they are enacting an aspect of their psyche they cannot bear to look at. Not all men, a lot of men. And the women, because they are not part of the dominant discourse in the same way, are able to be ironists about that purification of the soul which leads to murder. So, you know, what do we do with killing? That's what you're asking. Now, at the same time as I come at this psychoanalytically, I also think we have to come at this historically. So if we take the nation state of Israel and we take Gaza that's happening today and we take psychoanalysis, for me it is really not a coincidence that at the very moment that Herzl was founding the Zionist political organization in Baal in 1897, Freud was starting the work that would lead to the studies on hysteria. So at the very moment that a new form of Jewish nationalism, in response to persecution, it must be said, it is a drive for national self-determination. At the very moment that that attaches itself to a romantic Germanic nationalism based on soil, land, blood, descent, faith, the moment it does that, it is in big trouble. And Hannah Arendt writes brilliantly about this. This is a concept of the nation state which doesn't protect anybody. It makes the people who are assigned to it more vulnerable than ever, because the whole of their business then becomes tied up with trying to secure themselves against the violence they're going to provoke by being such an exclusive, violent, virulent, hate-ridden form of nationalism. And Netanyahu not only says this is a war of resurrection, linking straight into the apocalyptic strain of Zionism, but he also says, I mean, it's clear, he passed the National Land Act, which said that only self-determination for the Jewish people can take place in the land of Israel. And Arabic has been downgraded. It's no longer one of the two languages within which things can be taught. So these moves are for a form of nationalism, and it's a tragedy. Because why did it, we know why, but why? Well, certain people like Martin Buber and Hannah Arendt were really on the case, and Ahad Ha'am, they thought it was a disaster that was unfolding because Israel was importing into the Middle East the very form of pure, over-idealized, race-based nationalism that they had had to flee from in the heart of Europe. And somebody once said to me, an interesting Israeli speaker, writer, he's a poet actually, and he just said, the Jews could not be Europeans in Europe, they were the Semitic other. So they had to go somewhere where they could be where they could have another Semitic other, which is the Arabs, so that they could be the true. Only in Israel could they be true Europeans. Herzl says this in his writing. Only by going there will we become true Germans. So there's something hideous repeating itself in this narrative, which just confirms itself at every turn. There is no doubt in my mind, and there may well be dissenters in this room, that what we are witnessing in Gaza is an absolute inability to think about an ending in the way that you're describing
Interminable.
It's interminable. It's a war of resurrection, and I don't know about anybody else in this room, but we're waiting with dread for the ceasefire to break. And they're sitting ducks now. They've all gone back. The Palestinians have gone back to their homes, even if they're rubble. At least Trump was honest about this. He said it's uninhabitable. He's right. He's now calling for all hell to break loose, right? And they're just sitting there on their homes. I can't bear to think about it. We have to think about it. But it's not, let's just say it's not looking good. I don't know if I think we have to, it's what we want to touch on, we want to hold on to the demonic aspect of human behavior, which leads to your work on truth and forgiveness, which we'll get to now. It's crucial we talk about that, Pumla. But we also have to historicize. I think that's the point I'm trying to make.
We always have to historicize, but history gets us to the point of repetition, doesn't it? And then the question is, what is bearing witness? I mean, if bearing witness is not acting, in response, in the way that it meant, at the end of World War II, where does it leave us? It's almost as if everything that we know, we have to unknow it, or we have to create new histories. Is it a revolution in the way that Rosa Luxemburg, for example, speaks about a belief in revolution, or is it the more hopeful vision that Simone Weil speaks about, that there must always be hope? So where does it land us as the witnesses of the moment?
Simone Weil is an amazing thinker, and I use a quote from her as the epigraph to a new book that came out last year called Play.
Yeah, you remind me.
And she says there's always room for hope. As long as we are here and we do not accept the situation as it is and we want something different, then we are living in a world of hope. So she really isn't hearing despair. And of course, for Luxemburg, revolution was not despair, although she obviously thought she owed the revolution a death. She knew at the end of her life she was going to be assassinated. It's clear. But these are inspirational figures who would not compromise. And I think part of the problem is, well, I don't want to make too crass historical generalizations, but part of the problem is that if we go to 1989, that was meant to be the end of history, right? The fall of the wall was meant to be the end of history, and the neoliberal capitalist ethos was meant to have triumphed. Well, I'm pretty close to people like, in thinking to people like Ashim Bembe, who say our task today is to create a planetary commons in which we all share the resources of the earth and live in the world, on the planet together. So we need a planetary humanism. And then he pauses and says, at a time when we are destroying the planet. Right? So how do you square those two things?
The ambiguity.
Yes, so the post-1989 dispensation has been neoliberalism without consequence, without accountability, without responsibility, without equality, without justice. I mean, we've seen it. I mean, if you read people, I don't know if any of you read people like Wendy Brown's Undoing the Demos. It's a fabulous book about how neoliberalism relies on disposable bodies. That's what it does. That's what it creates workers and unemployed people as. And it's what Hannah Arendt was talking about. Once you have stateless people after the Treaty of Versailles, then they become exterminatable. They're stateless. They simply represent the darkness of mere difference. They have not a leg politically, historically to stand on. And therefore they are vulnerable to extermination. I mean, she's amazing on this. In that, the chapter, it's called The End of the Fall of the Rights of Man.
The End of the Rights of Man.
The End of the Rights of Man. The Fall of the Nation State and the End of the Rights of Man. If you come away from today with one little thing you're going to read, go and read that. Well, I'm not going to have time to do what I wanted to do, was to take 3 extraordinary essays by Pumla Gobodo-Madikizela, which I have been reading and rereading for this visit. And what's happening? Student protest. Should we be on the student protest? Stay here.
Is it fees? I didn't hear about
Yeah.
fees, yeah.
They
They
might
come call us all out.
They might call
Yeah.
us out.
At which point, that's where you
Then we
make
go.
a decision. Now,
Okay. So it's very moving. It's very okay. Pumla's interminable project, for which she has cast
the afterlife of violent histories.
the afterlife of violent history, the lack of justice, the lack of redistribution, neoliberalism, capture by the state, right? I've had 2 Uber drivers this week who said they're putting all their hopes in the unity government. He said it's less easy for the individual parties to take the money. As simple as that, because they're being watched by each other.
True.
Okay, well, I will be led by you. All right, so let's see what happens. There's one moment in, so basically 3 articles. One, Remorse's ethical encounter and the impossibility of repair. Listen to these titles. One of Aesthetics of Memory, Witness to Violence and a Call to Repair. That's 2020. And then the last one, which of course I can't find, it's on the afterlife of apartheid, on the ambiguous or triguous space and temporality with which you feel you have to work with. I've been very, very struck by the way you will not let up on your subjects, right? Not just Decon, but also Marcia Kuza, right? That is to say, people who have a kind of transformative experience out of an encounter, which does not lead to an idealization of the self, that leads to remorse that is obviously partial, incomplete, and can even be self-destructive. It can be too much to live with. And I suppose what I wanted to ask you was how you live on those borders. I mean, you give the most incredible description in the book on Decon about you. You're like Anna O. Your arm freezes, the arm that you have a beautifully historical symptom, right? It's just breathtaking. But nonetheless, it is as if you're struggling all the time, whether it's through Winnicott, whether it's through Abraham and Torok, whether it's through Melanie Klein, which our friend from Cape Town, psychotherapist, was telling me was the main way of thinking in the psychoanalytic community in Cape Town. Whether any of these concepts can work towards a transformation which will not be a form of false innocence. Because if it ends up with false innocence, then it will repeat the violence, because it has to preserve its innocence at all costs and will kill anybody to preserve its innocence because it's projected onto the other person, so they can just be mowed down. So I feel you're engaged in a project which more and more calls on psychoanalysis, but it's the demonic repetition, at least as much as Eros. Freud had this opposition between Eros and Thanatos. Didn't work, because as he said, Eros is hugely helped by a little admixture of sadism. So this was one of his great binaries around which the whole psychoanalytic community organized itself for a while, and it collapses. I mean, it just doesn't work. So Freud is the binarist who constantly fails to find an answer, and he used it. One of his last essays was Analysis Terminable and Interminable, which was about how there are certain forms of anxiety that can never be assuaged, and there's certain forms of subjective self-division in the unconscious which cannot be flattened out. And if you try to do it, you will just deceive yourself.
Because it's always breaking.
It's always breaking.
Always breaking.
It's always breaking. And I suppose I'd like to ask you a question about what happens to the people who've gone through various stages of remorse. You talk about witness stand remorse and how deceptive that can be. And you talk about Marcia Koza, but of course I'm thinking of Chris Hani's daughter. Chris Hani's daughter, who became sort of friends with the man who had killed her father. But when he becomes really attached to her and says, "Do you mind me saying that I'm proud of you?" she just says, "You murdered my father," right? That's to say, there's so far she will go and no further. And her family was wrecked. One sister died of drug addiction. One was involved in a car accident. She'd struggled with drugs for over a decade. I mean, it is
Saved herself.
she managed to save herself by writing the book. How that connects to the need for real recognition, historic transformation. I'm thinking of what Yako said yesterday. There is, you tell me, but the way I'm looking and listening, the absence of justice in South Africa has been one of the most heartbreaking political disappointments of our time. And I think you want the psyche to be ahead of that, or at least to be the place where that can be fully acknowledged.
It's the searching, Jacqueline. It's the searching. You ask the question of, how I go around all of this, and it's the constant searching, and knowing at the end that you said earlier you can't give an answer, but in the observation you see that there is some way that you can move around all of these complexities, and in the end all you're left with is to hold the ambiguity, that there is, at the same time, as you say, there's no justice, but at the same time there is the possibility of something moving, a potential for something to move. But that's not an answer except to say that we have these situations constantly, and because if you are faced with kind of a repetition of these histories, there must be at some point, a way of holding that truth and knowledge that this too will repeat itself. And so how do you stand in the heart of it all, knowing that it will repeat itself, and brace yourself for it? Do you brace yourself by, breaking out into violence, or do you break yourself by reaching out to try and see if you can contain the possibility of violence? It's, there aren't clear answers. Last week or 2 weeks ago, I was speaking at an event for Mongani Mayosi, who died by suicide in the wake of the Rose Must Fall movement. And there is no denying the fact that the reason that happened is because of the way that the struggle was staged. There is no denying that. And so in the talk, I had to find a way of pointing out that there is the violence, and that must happen in the context of the struggle. But at the same time, there is the murderousness of the violence itself in the struggle for freedom, and against oppression.
Well, I think that's beautifully put. And when I was writing about, I gave the VC's lecture in the middle of the protests about 5 years ago, only when amazing student and legal activists, who somebody you put on to me, started sending me documents from the protests and from the occupations. And it was only when she said, for 2 years I didn't go. I thought, you don't need a white academic from England coming and giving a lecture in the middle of all of this. Really not. But then when the feminist issue started breaking out in the middle of the protest movement, she said, please come. And that was the only terms under which I would come. And of course, that's another thing we haven't managed to talk about, but we're going to open it up for discussion. And just to say that in relationship to COVID, there was a real sense, I think, for a lot of people, that there would be an incompetence, there would be a sharing, there would be a recognition of the vulnerability of everybody, that COVID could be used to halt climate change, to repair the world, to cure the millions. It's not what happened. It's not what happened. The moment the pharmacists said they would not release the vaccination licenses to cheaper vaccinations and medicines, the moment that happened, it was effectively all over for a shared, equal worlding of what COVID was. The other thing that happened under COVID was an increase in femicide. Increase in femicide because women were many women stay at home. Stay at home save lives. Not so good. Feminism has been saying for centuries that staying at home is dangerous for women, especially if their husbands or partners are abusers. And also, I've written about this elsewhere in the book on mothers, women are expected to make the world okay. They're meant to hold everything together. They're meant to make their babies feel everything's fine. They're meant to make it, create a little bubble in, we're talking about bourgeois Western family structures here, where the mother is meant to be somehow the site of the replenishment of the whole social order by the fact of having a baby. This will be a better future, and that will protect their closest and nearest and dearest, above all their child, from mortality for as long as you possibly can. What would be one definition of being a mother? Well, with COVID, mortality came through the front door. There was no protection against mortality. Everybody was fragile, everybody was vulnerable, everybody could die at any time. And I think femicide went up because women were being punished for breaking that contract. Not a contract, by the way, that they could ever have respected. Because it was ridiculous. It makes no sense. But nonetheless, everything I read on mothers, it was as if, be happy. This is all wonderful. This is all perfect. Well, it's understandable. You have a lovely day with your grandson. You think the whole world's okay. It's not, right? It's just it's getting smaller and smaller, the space in which you can say it's all okay. It's not okay. So we need more political engagement and more conversations which stir up the stuff that we're being asked not to think about, which, by the way, now across Europe is Gaza. Especially Jewish people are being told not to think about Gaza, not to criticize, not to even call for a ceasefire. You may have things to say about the
and yet it's so much. I mean, it's something that you got in the same way that the Holocaust, when those photographs and images came from from the release of, we still celebrate, the world still celebrates
the liberation of the camps.
Liberation in January, and it was in your face all the time. And how can Gaza not be in our face? In our faces. You asked a question about, you were saying something about remorse, and I don't know if you've seen something that I've written on the limits of remorse, because this is actually what, for me, presents
remorse's ethical encounter and the impossibility of repair.
And the impossibility of repair. What happens when someone goes there, this is why so many of these people who take on the victim identity don't really want to look into what it is that they are doing, because the moment they look, then the truth is exposed. So
unbearable.
It's exactly, the unbearability of truth. But for those who can go there when the circumstances are created for them to do that, I'm sorry that I have to refer to de Kock, it's such an old story. But what that has shown us when looking at de Kock now in Remorse, you see that the reason that he collapsed, psychologically collapsed, disintegrated totally, because he was left alone to look into his own remorse and what he had done. There was no one. All of the people for whom he was doing this were nowhere to be seen. Nobody voted for apartheid. He was a bad apple, and so on and so forth. So he found, what is the meaning of what I was doing?
So his community deserted
him. Exactly. So that requires to be held by the wide community society for which he was performing these murderous deeds. This is why you hear also from Israel, when people, some of the IDF, who then join peace movements, they say the same thing. They say once we were faced with what we were really doing, they couldn't bear it. So they're able to go then and say, now we see what we're doing. But what does it take for that seeing to happen? Because for some of them, the seeing is not materializing at all. And for those who do see, it's not as if their world, everything becomes resolved. They live with the nightmare of now knowing. And sometimes the knowing and taking you to the abyss can destroy you. So it's better not to know.
Whoa. Well, where does that leave us, right? Because there was a dreadful murdering story in the UK about 30 years ago. Frederick West and his wife, Rosemary West. Some of you may remember this story. And there were bodies all buried through the garden. And I think Frederick West killed himself. And Rosemary West insisted to the end that she hadn't known. And it was very clear that if she admitted that she'd known, she would have two options, insanity or suicide. There were no other places that she could go. And some of you may have seen Downfall, the film about Hitler's last stand in the bunker. And it starts with his secretary in her 20s getting the job to be the private secretary to Hitler. She's over the moon about it. The film cuts at the end to her at the age of 90. And she insists she did not know. She She said, I did not know. And then she says, but I should have done. She inculcates herself. She takes responsibility for her failure. Find out. She said, I should have found out. I should have known what was going on. So there is a question here about knowing and not knowing. And of course, psychoanalysis is brilliant about the lengths we will go to deflect bad psychic news. If you just think of the vocabulary of psychoanalysis, repression, sublimation, suppression, foreclosure, denial, disavowal, psychosis, scotomization, it's incredible. It's like this panoply of terms to describe just how tormented a thing the mind is in its ability
when it represses,
to call itself what Christopher Bolas, who I think is a wonderful psychoanalyst, violent innocence. Because violent innocence, when in order to purge yourself, is a bit like projective identification in Melanie Klein. To preserve your innocence, not to go through the collapse and the shame that just makes you feel even less of a person than before, you project it onto another person. Then you fear their retaliation, then you have to kill them. So it gets worse and worse, right? But I suppose one of the reasons why I'm so committed to psychoanalysis is because it just, people sometimes say to me, do you want everybody to be analysed? And I say, well, no, because the only person who can make a decision about being analysed is the analysand. It's the only form of treatment where the demand to go through it can only be accepted from the patient themselves. Other, like pretty much every other form of medicine where it goes through the pharmacy or it goes through the surgeon or it goes through whatever the form of diagnosis is. So for me, psychoanalysis is so crucial because it really helps us to think, it's most simple, about everything you've been going through and writing about for the last 3 decades. And at moments I feel, there's an essay in here on lament, where you go back to the cry of Namondo Kalata, and you say that is a lament for the future. And when you talk about the triple order of time through which trauma goes, it's as if you're saying something is happening in the trauma of the moment, which is actually a predictive future, a lament for what is going to come. And forgive me if I've said this before, but it often seems to me you're working with Lacan's Future Perfect. Did I mention this yesterday?
You mentioned it to me, but
let me just give the formula and then I'll shut up. Which is, Lacan said the time of psychoanalysis is not the past of what once was and is no more. That would be repetition. It's not what still is. Sorry, it's not, that would be repression. What once was but is no more, repression. It's not what still is in what once was, which would be repetition. It is what I will have been for what I am in the process of becoming. And that's so fabulous, right? And it really goes to the heart of your triadic temporality, which is you've got to go back, otherwise you're just effacing part of your mental life. But you need to do what Winnicott described, the analyst Winnicott described, as looking for a piece of his patient, looking for a piece of his past in the future, because he couldn't live it in the past. It was too difficult. So you could only look for it in the future and cart it forwards with you. So you just carry something. This might be a word for responsibility. You carry a responsibility to your own mental life and through that to everybody else's. Because if you know everybody has an unconscious, then you know nobody is a master in their own home. Nobody has the right to control anybody else completely. You don't control your own thoughts. So psychoanalysis is a brilliant answer to what Hannah Arendt calls impotent bigness, and to the idea of mastery and thinking you can rule the world in some way, which is totalitarian belief. It's brilliant. Psychoanalysis, she hated psychoanalysis, by the way. But I think it's a very good...
And yes, it draws from it.
She draws from it a lot. Yes, she does. She does.
But it's, this idea of, again, you make reference to the piece about the lament and sort of the staging of the future. It's also about repetition. It's also the sense that things are going to repeat themselves. And when it is violence, and particularly in the context of histories that are bearing the burden of a lot of other complicated histories of violence, that there is almost always that, the staging, the event itself, the moment itself of the wail, of the cry. When you think about, for instance, there is the famous Fred Morton writes about the famous anti-Hester's scream. I think it's represented also in the film, I think 12 Years a Slave, where the woman, or at least aspects of it are representing. And of course, Toni Morrison writes about, this rememory, the return of the memory in such violent ways.
As a ghost.
As a ghost, but you see, as a ghost, but then if you are, but that's literature, but if you're thinking real life experience, the Fred Morton reference to the anti-Hester's witnessing his aunt being beaten by the master owner of his aunt in such violent ways, and how when he is freed as a slave, he says Auntie Hester's scream on the day, with all of its dramas, the blood on the gate that she was holding on to, the dripping of the blood on the floor, when the scream, the sound of the scream that he remembers, that is the lament. And then how, as he is freed, all of that returns, all of that he witnesses as if it's happening all over again. It's no longer the anti-Hester's scream. And so when you think about historically all of these trajectories of trauma and suffering, Normandy's scream at the Truth Commission in 1996, that scream of anti-Hester's in African-American enslavement, how all of these are connected. And you can think about so many other screams of women who are bearing the memories of screams of women that were unscreamed. And now we are witnessing them again. I mean, you can think about the women in Gaza whose faces, with their babies, who are wrapped up, about to be buried. They've just been born, and they are just about to be buried. All those screams coming together, we have to think about, how do we understand this? How do we even find language to speak about all of these screams that are hovering over our histories of colonialism, of oppression, in ways that they were never spoken about. And now we are being confronted with them over and over again. And yet life must go on. The students, they are protesting, but they must register and they must pass their degrees, and they're going to be speaking about these issues in their own work. We are living side by side the traumas, and the challenge is, how do we find our way? How do we navigate our way through these moments of remembering reality, at the same time live together without necessarily always reminding ourselves about, what you did or what your ancestors did and what my ancestors suffered? Because then if we do that, we are left with what we are witnessing in Gaza.
That was fabulous, by the way. I'll just say something briefly because time's up. We're going to open up to you now, but I do just want to say something about that. I think the idea of the voices of the unscreamed is something I'm sure I'm not the only person who will take away from this discussion today. That's extraordinary. Beautiful formula. It's not just, I don't think ghosts are just in literature. I think ghosts are part of who we are. There's been a lot of writing about psychoanalysis and haunting, and the people where people fly, which is what Abraham and Torok are writing about. The encrypted in the child's unconscious are the unlived or unspoken histories of the parents, and it often refers to the Holocaust. But I think we need here, I do think we need Freud's idea of the death drive, because you've been talking about demonic repetition, and that is one aspect of the death drive, the ability of soldiers to come back from the war and start repeating their traumas because they're so stuck in them they can't help but do so. There's also the death drive as a reference to a kind of demonic repetition, which is to do with a sadism that keeps on speaking somewhere in the constitution of the psyche. But then there's the most important aspect of all, which is the organism wishes to die its own death, which is something about our relationship to dying. And I think it's no coincidence that right in the middle of COVID, when everybody was vulnerable, and it was at our front doors, when we had to look at it everywhere, people like, I don't even want to say their names, all those rich guys with more money than sense were sending off experiments into the stratosphere, doing spaceships in the stratosphere. investing money in Silicon Valley to produce an elixir which would make death a poor and unnecessary memory. That's to say, the hallucinogenic force of the defiance of mortality is one of the things that leads people to exert power without limit and without impunity, right? It's the belief that you can just do it and the other people don't count. I think you incorporate back Freud's idea of the death drive as dying one's own death, being accompanied by death through one's life. It's Philip Pullman or whether it's Toni Morrison, then something shifts in your register to history. And I think that's very creative. But I realize it's not an answer to anything.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, okay. So I'm going to invite everyone to engage with Jacqueline in whatever way is on your mind. I can see already you are wanting to ask, itching to ask a question. So please, the floor is yours.
Yeah, I was thinking about a very huge difference between the experience of Auschwitz and Gaza. In my opinion, Auschwitz was Europeans against Europeans, while Gaza are Europeans against, or white against indigenous populations, so a repetition of colonialism. So the final thoughts that you introduced were very interesting to me. How this machine is a machine of colonialism, of conquering other people. Gaza seems to have in its destiny the fact to become the Riviera of white people for the future, which is really horrible in a way, but it makes this story very different from the Auschwitz one.
Well, I totally agree with you. I would simply say that the attempt to turn what's happening in Gaza into simply an aspect of colonial history, I think is a bit tricky, because what precipitated Israel was the need for the national self-determination of a persecuted people. They latched onto European colonialism, you're absolutely right, but it isn't only that. I've been at so many discussions where the genuine and justified critique of Israel as colonial settlement has meant that nobody was allowed to talk about the Jews' history of persecution. And I think we shouldn't have to make that choice. I really think we shouldn't. Otherwise, I totally accept it.
Yes, Julie.
Um,
And then you. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, this has been really very helpful thinking through just, I think what's been a very overwhelming time. I mean, just even thinking, so maybe that's why I want to ask you. I mean, so we've talked about Gaza, but I mean, when we have been challenging some of what's happened there, people would always say, yeah, but what about the DRC? Or what about Sudan? Or what about Ukraine? Or what about, so there's this, and in some sense, I feel even since January 20th, I mean, it's been even increasing the almost the shock doctrine or the flooding the zone. It's almost, it's now in Panama and it's there and it's all, it's just so overwhelming. And I mean, I think it's a strategy of creating just chaos. But how do we, even just living with all of that, almost continue? Because I mean, it's just so overwhelming. You can't focus on one singular issue. It's everywhere, and yeah.
I agree with that. It's everywhere. But I think we have to also try and analyze what's going on in specific instances, like the conversation we just had about Gaza. Because otherwise, before you know where you are, you've put atrocity into the realm of the ineffable. And once you do that, as my sister Jacqueline Rose, the philosopher, wrote, you have sacralized it, and you fall into the trap of Holocaust piety. You fall into the trap of rendering pious acts of violence at any point, by the way. It's not just Holocaust piety. But you have to be careful not to allow these things to be sucked into the realm of the unrepresentable, because then you're absolutely without any power or choice. So we have to, the fact that we're in a bit of a muddle today, and I feel a lot of what I've said was a real muddle, okay, doesn't mean that we don't have to, it's precisely why we have to go on thinking as carefully as we can. And then there are decisions to be made, like about the demonstration, like the letters we write, I understand there was a protest about Gaza in this university, it didn't get through the faculty. Then you need to have another protest. It's not for you to say what you need. Maybe there are people here who disagree with that. That's fine.
So I don't know, the thought is a bit muddled, but I was thinking along the lines of, not necessarily in terms of this seminar, but kind of in a way that like therapeutic words and stuff has almost been weaponized, and kind of thinking about the power of like psychoanalytical thinking and understanding things, but also the danger of it removing the autonomy of people's actions in sort of what is happening, kind of, and how to sort of, I guess, like reconcile those two ways, like two kind of edges of it as a kind of tool or analysis.
You're so right. I mean, psychoanalysis is a call to a kind of radical, ethical, and potentially political responsibility for your life and for everything you're in touch with. And what we're being, it relates to the last question, what we're being flooded with at the moment is the idea that we can do nothing. That this is the order of the world, or it's inevitable, or must be allowed to take its course. I mean, I cannot believe how many people have opposed even opposition to the ceasefire, starting with the leader of the Labour Party and the Prime Minister in England. People are being thrown out of the Labour Party for calling for a ceasefire, right? So that it is as if you put that so well, as if on the one hand, this is all unfolding. On the other hand, we feel as if we're having our understanding and connection to it dismantled, so we will not see it as our problem. It's a bit like the Israeli families who, during the last war against Gaza, went onto the hill that came to be known as the Hill of Shame. You go onto the hill overlooking Gaza, and they cheered every time a bomb was dropped. Families with young children. You know, you've just got to ask, what is going on here? How is this possible, even? And I think a lot of people are feeling that. Thank you.
And that we're watching it. Kobano, and then
He was first, Jaco.
Oh.
Jaco was first. Yeah.
oh, okay, Jaco.
I just wanted to say something quickly. You know, I kept thinking as the conversation was going about the connection between, because I'm, you know, at heart still a lawyer. I think about what is a witness at law, and a witness at law is someone who is going to testify, who will testify, and that's a kind of reporting, of course, a lawful reporting. But it seems to me that what is now happening is the undoing, the deliberate undoing of that connection between witnessing and testimony. It seems that on a global scale, our right, our entitlement to testimony because of witnessing, or as a result of witnessing, is being eroded and attacked from all sides.
That's so interesting.
That's actually why we decided to have this conversation precisely. I mean, we didn't articulate it so clearly as you do, but we were driven almost by that quandary that, you know, what is it? It's almost like, yes, you are, but you can't testify. And I think that's a beautiful way of actually bringing the law into dialogue with this thinking.
This would be a very good definition of the culture wars. Because when you think that the culture wars are about is not hearing the unscreamed screams, it's about insisting that the history of the British Empire is glorious and positive and to be acclaimed and celebrated and so on and so forth. And it's really been at the heart of so much, central to the last election in America and central to what's going on in the UK and other places. You could say that what the culture wars are doing in insisting the history be told as a claim, with acclamation and success and service to the world, British Empire, never mind the slavery, that's exactly what it's trying to do. Sever the link between historic witness and testimony, so the words will be ineffective. So it's a real struggle. It's a struggle going on in the schools. And was it DeSantis who said he was going to abolish critical race theory? We discussed critical race theory. And there wasn't
It has been done.
It's
but I
done.
thought that he was talking about somewhere where he was going to abolish critical race theory, where there was nothing being taught in the schools. already.
Oh yeah, well, I wouldn't be surprised.
I think that's one of his cock-ups. But then now, of course, with diversity studies and everything else, it's all going out the window. Yeah.
In fact, from research, there's a whole list now of research, the kinds of things that you can't do under research if you're funded by the states. Amazing. Kopano?
Thanks, Pumla and Jacqueline. This has been wonderful, really. And there's so many things. I thought a little bit disorganized because I want to hold on to a number of things. One is last year we had
Speak up a little bit.
3 guests that Pumla had, and one of them was a Jewish scholar. Remember, Seth. Yes. Seth was saying something you said today. Seth was saying, well, bearing witness, even if you see, you can't believe. Your psyche just refuses to admit this, and so then we end up at the point where, what's the answer? If you are, and Jacqueline, you just said the same thing. You take your families and their children to the hill and they're seeing bombing. It's like the psyche can't digest this thing that's happening. That is not death, is not maiming, is not killing. Which, second point connected to that. So last year here, members of Senate, in Senate, one was wondering, how can our colleagues not bear witness, if you will? How can they not move for the university to condemn, to make a statement against what's... So they see this, but they can't just seem to digest. So that was the second thing about this. And then the last thing I want to mention is, it's as if, so what was happening about students, maybe I'll say that last, but Jacqueline, you said something earlier, that every day when I wake up and the Palestinians are moving back to their homes, and you're thinking, it's going to happen today, after Trump and Netanyahu's, that they're going to make this into the Riviera. You're thinking, you live this with this anxiety that what's the end of this? I mean, if people can just see the destruction and still want to destroy more. So that's but the last thing, when students are protesting outside and we're sitting here, and one moment is a wonderful, I don't know what is wonderful, it's a sublime contradiction. So we want to address these questions that are troubling us, but immediately they're repeating outside.
Immediately?
Repeating the struggles of students, which are struggles about recognition, about fees, about the environment. And it's a really poignant contradiction that we're witnessing. So I want to be here and I want to be outside. I want to be outside because that's that struggle. But this is also part of the struggle of making sense of some of the things that lead to what's happening outside. So there was a comment and he was pointing out how many things I want to just hook on in this conversation to clarify, if possible, the end.
That was
Can
great.
I add something?
I just want to say that's great. I'm not going to gloss what you said. I think you said what you said, and you've summed up various aspects of what's circulating in this room really graphically. So I appreciate that.
But I think you have to say something because I mean you've thought about this, so you must say something. That's what I wanted to add before you say something. That Seth actually what Kopano is remembering. Seth says something even more poignant. He says you grow up, seeing it in a certain way that it's actually not happening. It's ingrained in your head that what you see is a lie. So it's and when one reads how young people are taught what that identity means at school, the songs they sing, it's so powerful that Seth actually, I thought this was, I so appreciated his honesty. He says, I had an image that we put up on the screen of a Palestinian woman holding a child with blood in the, about to be buried. And Seth says, this is now, and his partner is Palestinian, and Seth is deeply involved in this conversation. He says, there's something in my head that actually returns to that kind of knowing and that kind of erasure of what is so clear before my eyes. There was that moment, but because he's already engaged in this reflective dialogue, he knows that he has to unseat that thought, because now he knows it's not true.
That's the work.
Isn't that the work?
That's the work
of
right?
psychoanalysis as well. I mean,
What
so
you can
that's
and
what
can't
you can
see,
tell
what
us.
you can and can't bear to see. But I didn't feel you were asking a question. Forgive me. I felt you were just describing very graphically the process through which the mind can actually eject things which are too difficult to tolerate. And then you're raising a question about what that does to your political identification. Right. So, when rabbis for human rights take out advertisements in Haaretz newspaper about house demolitions and ask the Israeli people to return to a tradition of righteousness and equality and fairness and, remember ye were strangers in the land of Israel, right? That's a biblical quote. Justice, justice ye shall pursue, which one of the radical rabbis we've communicated with says that is a conditional. That is saying only if you pursue justice you have right to the land of Canaan. And then there are people, wonderful writers like David Gerovich, who just writes about the fact that in Jewish law, God is never present on the land. He's an inspiration and a spirit and a smoke, and there's a whole relationship through him to the land, but it is not one of possession or ownership. And therefore, if you look at the discussion around Canaan and you look at justice, justice ye shall pursue, and remember you were strangers in the land of Israel, then the whole edifice of a pure self-serving nationalism starts to disintegrate. But as you said, this is an argument on the streets, it's an argument in spaces like this. I mean, there aren't that many spaces like this. I mean, I'm just knocked sideways by it and by the work you've been doing for the last 3 more decades. And those of us who are involved in psychoanalytic thinking, I mean, to put it in its most simple, we believe it makes all the difference. But what difference does it make?
Right.
And I can't put it any other way.
See why I asked you to respond. Okay, Anel. Yes.
I have a question, and I'm interested in you mentioned conversations surrounding victimhood and victimhood as identity, victimhood and victimhood as identity, and then victimhood as something that happens to you. And what does victimhood mean in settler colonial nations? So something happened over this weekend where a group of Afrikaners marched in Pretoria, and they held up banners and they said, Trump and Elon, save us. And they sang, I think that isn't the worst part, they sang the stem. With the stem, which is the old apartheid national anthem.
They sang the older part.
They sang the full old South African anthem. And the whole preface to this meteoric rise of apartheid is victimhood. So we were the victims of the British. We were the victims of the South African war. And then how dangerous that victimhood status is, because we're seeing it being replicated in real time now. Because now they are getting refugee status in the States. So I think that conversation surrounding victimhood, the victimhood as identity, is so important. And not just something that happens to you. Because I think, like Prof mentioned, us sitting here having this conversation and grappling with these issues, and in real time, you hear students and you hear struggle songs playing outside. And in how that is juxtaposing what is happening globally. I think it's not something that's sitting well for many of us in the room.
Okay, there's 2 more hands. Shall we take all of them? Yeah. So, Ayanda.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this conversation. I think I'm always thinking about the future and the generation that will go on to shape the future that hopefully is a better future. I'm a mother, yes. So since becoming a mother, I'm always thinking about the future and have become quite hopeful, right? Have become quite hopeful. And this particular conversation has sort of taken me back to a memory, a recent memory actually, where we went to Ghana and we visited the slave dungeons there with a group of American students. And following that encounter, I was then invited to speak to a group of students who are taking philosophy, predominantly white male students, American, most of them, who were saying that they were struggling to feel, right? So they'd been there, they saw these atrocities, Ghana. So they saw these horrible things that have happened. And I get invited to kind of help them think about what should we feel? Why is it that we're feeling numb? And some of the themes that came out of that conversation was trauma fatigue and just a sense of disconnect, right? So I try to speak to them about the importance of history and how history can help us to make sense and form connections to broader systems of capitalism and But also, I also talk to them about, Ubuntu as this philosophy of feeling with and being with others, right? But the point I want to connect to this particular conversation, what disturbed me was just this inability to feel, right? Because I'm always thinking of the classroom as a site of possibility. This is where we are formed as people, right? Fine, you have the family as the primary agent of that process of formation. But the classroom is where the process of conscientization and knowing the world and systems, that possibility happens. And then I become a bit disillusioned, right? When I think about the state of our education, because these are young people who will go on and shape the world. So where do we see the possibility for history, psychoanalysis, and education to intersect for the kind of world that we imagine?
Should we take the last one from Stephen? Stephen, you with the last question.
There's so much.
Yes, yeah.
I don't really have a very focused question, but the idea of the failure of bearing witness has so many dimensions to it. So, one that came to me, it's not particularly profound either, is the failure of Israel to face up to the Nakba. It's like the original sin. And it is so dark when one really thinks about it, given the experience of many of those people who came out of Nazi Europe and then inflict this so quickly on another people who happen to be there. So the failure to actually witness, and then all this projector machinery. The other is the bearer of all the darkness and all that you're saying. So psychoanalytically, it's really interesting. But then I started thinking, and I'll need to stop soon because otherwise this thought will go on for a long time. So you have two people, my father and his brother. My father, so they flee Germany in 36 and 38. Their parents and siblings are murdered in Auschwitz. And they come out with such different trajectories. My father, Israel meant nothing to him, really. It wasn't, well, he never spoke to me about it. And, and also there was a kind of silence. I wrote a thing called Silence in My Father's House, trying to grapple it after the TRC. And it's another story about it. So I never got any of that ethno-nationalism. My father's brother became a revisionist Zionist and gave his children more of a strong sense of the utter importance of the state of Israel. So within one family, very different orientations. And it complicates it because, let me leave it there because otherwise it could take too much time.
Wow.
Well, it sounds horrendous what you witnessed, the apartheid demonstration. It sounds deeply disturbing. And the fact that they endlessly, reinforce themselves as the historic victims of the situation they now find themselves in, because there's no way into that. It's like a symptom. It hardens, clicks into place, and it's kind of unbudgeted. There's a conversation we're not going to have now, but we may have it at another time over the next few days, which is the way the problem of victimhood also is at the core of feminist thinking and what to do with that. And Catherine McKinnon will be the person to talk about here, and the idea that women are the victims of patriarchy and the victims of men and so on and so forth. An issue I argue with in my writing because I feel it's a doomed scenario because there's no break in the symptom or the system. What's so important about psychoanalysis is that the amount of energy that is used in constituting the symptom to allow you to go on denying your own agency in your life and in history more broadly is always excessive. The energy is more than the system can tolerate. The demand is too great. So if only in your dreams, jokes and slips of the tongue, which is why for Lacan that's where you start with Freud, because they're all non-neurotic phenomena. It's only in dreams, jokes, splits of the tongue is good. Slips of the tongue that something breaks through the sound barrier and gives you access to what could be another way of thinking. So really you need to talk to Stephen. Yeah, you two, and Ellen and Stephen need to have a conversation because you're talking about something manifesting itself on the street in your face, and you're talking about a family split, not actually split, but split down the middle between Jabotinsky, which is the form of reactionary revisionist Zionism, which is now ruling Israel. I mean, he was the only one, by the way, who was willing to say that the Arabs had memories and that it would take a war to free the land. I'm looking at you about colonial. Who was it who asked about colonialism? Oh, you did, right at the very beginning. Right, so he had the decency to say this will take a war because they have their memories and it's their land and they hate us, and it's not surprising that they do. Okay, so what between you've muscled up is kind of forms of fixation and forms of flexibility or forms of disinterest, the panoply of different positions that people can take. It's always a bit depressing because you want to think people are either on the case with Gaza or they're apologizing for Israeli state violence. You want to think it's one or the other, and somehow it's got to be resolved, which is not necessarily very helpful because it's through these channels of vague communication that the thing these things take place or transform themselves. I was very interested in what you said about congratulations on being a mother, by the way. And of course, for Hannah Arendt, forgive me, I'm not idealizing, I hope not. For Hannah Arendt, natality was the most important generative moment in a social life because it was a new beginning. So every birth was a new beginning. And she said beautifully, that is why all totalitarian systems become eugenicist and never tolerate a new birth, because you never know what that creature is going to end up saying. So natality is not a moment where you kind of coerce your infant into the social norms of language and sexual difference, although it's also that, by the way, therefore. It is actually an opening. Something completely different could emerge out of that space. And then we watch all the ways in which the culture works to make sure that doesn't happen. Yeah. Adrian Rich is brilliant on this, to make sure that doesn't happen. And then that's a political struggle you're involved with, whether you like it or not. So I think what you said was very, very important. Thank you.
Wow, I'm sure this just has been so wonderful. You were with us. Just the way that you approach these topics and themes, and in such a profound way, because you're such a deep thinker about these things. And if we had time, I would ask about you, who you are and how the birth of all of this way of thinking, because it's also important, and maybe you talk about it when we meet with our students, because again, as you asked me last night, I was thinking, wow, I mean, it comes from somewhere. It comes from some major moments in your life, whether, your political consciousness was, awoken by something. There must be some history that is interesting more than these topics. Which
can I just add something?
Yes, please.
I'm not going to answer your question.
Oh, okay.
And you're right. But what I wanted to say was that it's there have been a couple of moments in my life where I've really thought I must have done something right. And one was when I was invited to be in conversation with Nadella El-Sadawi, the wonderful Egyptian woman writer, to launch her new translations of her books about 4 or 5 years ago, and an amazing influencer called Ms. Metropolis and me on the platform. And I sat there thinking, I must have done something right to find myself sitting here today. So this is another moment, right, like that, where I'm thinking, I must have done something right in my life to be sitting here in conversation.
Aren't we lucky?
You. So,
Aren't we lucky?
well, I think I'm the one who's
Yes.
lucky. So thank you so much, and I hope I will meet any of you who would like to continue the conversation.